Have you ever imagined what would happen if Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and every other social media platform suddenly went dark at exactly the same moment, creating a global communication blackout that left billions of people digitally stranded? Or wondered whether such a simultaneous collapse could happen by coincidence, or if it reveals something fundamental about how interconnected digital systems can fail catastrophically when they reach critical thresholds? What if I told you that the February 2026 Great Social Media Collapse wasn't a series of independent technical failures? It was an inevitable demonstration of Emmy Noether's conservation principles applied to network physics at global scale, showing how digital ecosystems can undergo sudden phase transitions when their energy and information loads exceed critical stability limits. Today, I'm going to reveal why the simultaneous death of all major social platforms followed predictable mathematical laws that govern how complex networks collapse under their own success. The morning of February 15, 2026, will be remembered as the day the digital world went silent. At approximately 9:23 a.m. UTC, Instagram users began reporting feed loading failures. Within minutes, TikTok stopped serving videos. Twitter's timeline froze globally. Facebook became unreachable. Snapchat messages failed to send. YouTube uploads stalled. LinkedIn connections died. Even smaller platforms like Discord and Reddit experienced cascading failures. For the first time in internet history, virtually all major social media platforms experienced simultaneous, complete service outages that lasted over 48 hours, affecting more than 4 billion users worldwide. Emmy Noether's insights about conservation laws and system stability provide the key to understanding why this wasn't a coincidence, but an inevitable consequence of how network physics operates at global scale. Digital networks, like all complex systems, must conserve energy, information, and computational resources according to mathematical principles. When these conservation limits are exceeded simultaneously across interconnected systems, the result isn't gradual degradation, it's catastrophic collapse that can propagate through the entire network ecosystem within minutes. The physics of network failure reveals why social media platforms are more vulnerable to simultaneous collapse than most people realize. These platforms don't operate as isolated systems, they're part of a vast, interconnected digital infrastructure that shares physical servers, internet backbone connections, content delivery networks, cloud computing resources, and even electrical power grids. When demand exceeds the capacity of shared infrastructure, failures cascade through the network following the same physics principles that govern avalanches, earthquakes, and other systems that can transition rapidly from stability to collapse. The conservation of computational energy becomes critical when understanding why all platforms failed together rather than independently. Modern social media platforms require enormous amounts of processing power to serve personalized content to billions of users simultaneously. The artificial intelligence algorithms that curate feeds, recommend content, and moderate posts consume vast computational resources. The energy physics underlying the collapse becomes apparent when examining the electrical power consumption of global data centers during the failure period. Social media platforms consume enormous amounts of electrical energy to power servers, cooling systems, and network infrastructure. The February 2026 collapse occurred during a period of peak global energy demand when multiple regions were experiencing electrical grid stress due to extreme weather conditions. The conservation of electrical energy required that non-essential power loads be reduced, and social media servers, despite their importance to users, represented discretionary power consumption that could be temporarily sacrificed to maintain grid stability. The information theory aspects of the collapse reveal how the conservation of data transmission capacity contributed to the simultaneous failures. The global internet infrastructure has finite bandwidth, a maximum amount of information that can be transmitted per unit time across the network. Social media platforms compete for this shared bandwidth resource, especially during periods of high user engagement. When multiple platforms simultaneously attempt to serve content to billions of users, whether due to breaking news, viral trends, or coordinated events, they can exceed the conservation limits of available bandwidth, forcing network systems to prioritize certain traffic while dropping others. The psychological and social physics of the collapse demonstrate how human behavior amplifies network failures through feedback loops that Emmy Noether would recognize as conservation principles operating in social systems. When users notice that their preferred platform is experiencing problems, they typically switch to alternative platforms, rapidly redistributing user load across the remaining functional systems. This behavioral response, while logical for individual users, creates massive spikes in demand for the surviving platforms that can push them beyond their own capacity limits, propagating the failure cascade. The economic physics of social media infrastructure also contributed to the vulnerability that enabled simultaneous collapse. The business models of social media companies incentivize maximizing user engagement and content consumption, which drives platforms to operate near their maximum sustainable capacity to minimize infrastructure costs while maximizing advertising revenue. This economic optimization creates systems that are efficient under normal conditions but lack the excess capacity needed to handle extraordinary demand spikes or absorb failures in related systems. The global supply chain dependencies of digital infrastructure reveal another layer of conservation constraints that contributed to the collapse. The physical hardware powering social media platforms, servers, networking equipment, storage systems, depends on complex international supply chains for components, maintenance, and replacement parts. Disruptions in these supply chains, whether due to geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, or manufacturing constraints, can create resource scarcity that reduces the redundancy and resilience of digital systems. The artificial intelligence algorithms that power social media content recommendation represent a particularly vulnerable component of the network ecosystem. These AI systems require massive computational resources and operate in ways that can amplify system failures through their complex feedback loops and unpredictable resource demands. When AI algorithms detect unusual patterns in user behavior or content distribution, they can dramatically increase their computational demands as they attempt to adapt to changing conditions, consuming resources that might otherwise be available to maintain basic platform functionality. The cybersecurity implications of the simultaneous collapse reveal how conservation principles in digital security can create systemic vulnerabilities. The shared infrastructure dependencies that enabled the cascade failure also create opportunities for coordinated attacks that could deliberately trigger similar collapses. A sophisticated adversary understanding network physics could potentially exploit conservation constraints to cause widespread digital disruption with relatively modest resources, demonstrating how knowledge of conservation laws can be weaponized. The international coordination challenges exposed by the collapse show how conservation principles operating across different national systems can conflict with local priorities and regulations. Social media platforms operate across multiple countries with different legal frameworks, technical standards, and infrastructure capabilities. When failures cascade across international boundaries, The conservation of resources and services must be balanced against conflicting national interests and regulatory requirements that can impede coordinated recovery efforts. The long-term implications of the February 2026 collapse extend to fundamental questions about the sustainability and resilience of global digital infrastructure as it continues to grow and become more interconnected. The conservation laws governing computational capacity, electrical power, and network bandwidth set absolute limits on how much digital infrastructure can expand before hitting physical and mathematical constraints that no amount of engineering optimization can overcome. The recovery process from the collapse also demonstrated conservation principles in action as engineers had to carefully balance resource restoration across different platforms and services while avoiding triggering additional cascade failures. The sequential restoration of services followed mathematical principles that prioritized critical infrastructure and gradually redistributed load to prevent overwhelming recently restored systems. The next time you experience a social media outage or wonder about the resilience of digital infrastructure, remember that you're dealing with systems that must obey Emmy Noether's conservation laws just as rigorously as any physical system. The February 2026 Great Social Media Collapse wasn't a technical failure, it was a physics demonstration showing how conservation constraints operate in digital networks at global scale. The simultaneous failure of all major platforms revealed the hidden dependencies and shared resource constraints that connect seemingly independent digital services. When conservation limits for computational energy, electrical power, and information transmission are exceeded simultaneously, the result is coordinated collapse that can shut down the digital infrastructure that billions of people depend on for communication, entertainment, and social connection. Understanding the physics behind network failures helps us appreciate both the remarkable achievement of maintaining global digital connectivity and the fundamental mathematical constraints that limit how robust these systems can become as they continue to grow and interconnect. The conservation laws that govern digital networks are as absolute as those governing physical systems, and respecting these limits is essential for maintaining the digital infrastructure that modern civilization depends upon. If you're fascinated by the intersection of network physics, digital infrastructure, and the conservation laws that govern global communication systems, subscribe to explore more ways that Emmy Noether's principles explain the hidden mathematics operating in the technology that connects our world. We're investigating how conservation laws, system stability, and cascade failures shape the digital infrastructure that most people take for granted until it suddenly disappears. Hit that subscribe button and join our exploration of network physics, digital systems theory, and the mathematical principles that determine whether global communication networks remain stable or collapse under their own complexity. We're uncovering the hidden physics operating in the internet, social media, and digital infrastructure, showing how Emmy Noether's insights about conservation and stability illuminate even the most dramatic failures in the systems that connect human consciousness across the planet.